the ancient Egyptians. No civilization in history has been so utterly obsessed with what happens after we die. They didn't just believe in an afterlife, they engineered one. They built mountains of stone to protect a single corpse. They wrote guidebooks for the dead, cheat codes to navigate a terrifying underworld. And at the heart of it all, there was a ritual, a gruesome, complex, and sacred process born from a single terrifying belief, the belief that if the body is lost, the soul is annihilated forever. Today, we journey back come years to the banks of the Nile, to the secret workshops of the embalmers. We will unlock the sacred base step process of mummification, and we will follow the soul on its perilous journey from the final breath to the field of reeds. This is the story of how the Egyptians defeated death itself. To understand how they did it, we must first understand why. For the Egyptian, the soul was not one single entity. It was a complex collection of spiritual parts. There was the Ka, the physical body. There was the Ka, a spirit double, your vital life force. After death, your Ka separated from you but remained in the tomb, requiring physical offerings of food and drink to survive. Then there was the Ba. This was your personality, your essence, everything that made you you. The Ba was depicted as a human-headed bird, and it had a special power. It could leave the tomb by day and fly in the world of the living. But every single night, the Ba had to return. It had to fly back into the darkness of the tomb and find its physical body, the Kat. It needed to reunite with its Ka, or it would perish. And finally, there was the Ak. If all the rituals were successful, the Ka and Ba would merge to become an Ak, a transfigured, shining, godlike spirit living among the stars. This created a terrible existential problem. The Ka was tied to the tomb. The Ba needed to find its body every night. But what if the body decayed? What if the Ba returned to the tomb and found nothing but dust? It would be a second death. The soul, with no anchor, would be lost forever, annihilated. Preservation was not about sentiment. It was an absolute, cosmic necessity. The body had to last forever. Mummification wasn't about preserving the dead. It was about building a permanent house for the soul, a house of flesh. And the masters of this sacred architecture were the embalmers. When a person of wealth died, the clock started ticking. The body was taken immediately to the Ibu, the place of purification. This begins step note, the ritual cleansing. The body was washed with water from the sacred Nile, symbolizing rebirth. It was then purified with palm wine, its high alcohol content acting as an antiseptic, killing the first surface bacteria. As this happened, the ritual mourning began. The family employed 2 professional female mourners known as the Kites. They represented the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, wailing and tearing their clothes in a performance of profound grief, setting the sacred stage for what was to come. Now, the body was moved to the Wabet, the embalmer's workshop. Here, the chief priest, the hairy Seshta, or overseer of the mystery, would often wear the mask of Anubis, the jackal god who presided over embalming. He was no longer just a man, he was a vessel for the god. And here, the true work began. Step high, the evisceration. The priest made a precise ritual incision on the left side of the abdomen, a cut just large enough for a man to reach his hand inside. He would then reach deep into the body cavity, and one by one, remove the organs that would cause the fastest decay. The stomach, the intestines, the liver, the lungs. This was a messy, brutal, and profoundly intimate act. The embalmers had to be anatomists, separating the organs from the web of connective tissue, all through one small opening. But one organ was left untouched: the heart, the Ib. To the Egyptians, the heart, not the brain, was the center of all intelligence, memory, and emotion. It was the Ka's anchor and the Ba's compass. More importantly, it was the soul's key witness, the one thing it desperately needed for its final trial. We will come back to this. The brain, however, was considered useless, just stuffing. In fact, the word for brain doesn't even appear in many hieroglyphic texts, so it had to be removed. But how? Without disfiguring the face. The method was ingenious and horrifying. The embalmers would take a long bronze hook and carefully chisel it through the thin bone of the ethmoid at the back of the nasal cavity right into the skull. They would then agitate the hook violently, turning the brain, which is 10% water, into a semi-liquid slurry. They would then turn the body over and let the liquefied brain pour out through the nostrils. Sometimes they would use a long, spatula-like tool to reach in and scrape out the remaining pieces of the skull lining. The now empty cranial cavity was then sterilized by pouring in hot liquid tree resin. The removed organs, stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs were too precious to discard. This was step ba, the canopic jars. The organs were individually washed in palm wine, dried, and anointed. Each was then placed in its own sacred canopic jar, which was filled with natron to preserve it. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti, the human-headed god, guarded the liver. Hapi, the baboon, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, the jackal, guarded the stomach. Kebesenuef, the falcon, guarded the intestines. These jars were, in essence, the soul's backup drive. They would be placed in the tomb next to the sarcophagus, ensuring the deceased had all their parts for the afterlife. Now, the most important step of all. The body was a hollow, wet shell. It had to be dried completely. This is step bone, the bone muide desiccation. The key was a miraculous substance harvested from the dry riverbeds near the Nile. It was called natron, a natural hygroscopic salt, a blend of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate. In simple terms, a powerful natural desiccant. The hollowed-out torso was stuffed with temporary bags of natron, and then the entire body was buried in a massive pile of it, over pounds of natron. And then they waited for bone mui days. This number was no accident. It was a sacred period of purification, the same time the star Sirius was absent from the sky. During this time, the natron worked its magic, drawing every last ounce of moisture from the flesh, the muscle, and the sinew. It dissolved the body's fats, preventing putrefaction. It was chemical engineering. Bone, years ago. After bone mui days, the body was unrecognizable. It was a shrunken, leathery, blackened husk, but it was permanent. It could now last for millennia. This bone mui day period, this transformative chemical miracle, is what separates a mummy from a mere skeleton. This is the part of the process that truly required faith. The family had to trust that this thing was what their loved one needed to become. The bone mui days were over, but the work was far from done. The mummy was now dry, but it was also empty. This is step num, the restuffing and anointing. The temporary natron bags were removed from the torso. The cavity was washed one last time. Then, it was permanently packed with linen, sawdust, and bags of fragrant resins like myrrh to restore the body's shape. They couldn't have the Ka or Ba returning to a caved-in shell. It had to look human. The skin, brittle from the salt, was then anointed. For hours, priests would rub the body with a complex mixture of priceless oils and resins, cedar oil, cumin oil, myrrh. This made the skin supple again, gave it a ritual perfume, and, most importantly, it made the skin waterproof, sealing it against any future moisture. The abdominal incision was sewn shut. A priest would place a plaque of beeswax, often carved with the sacred eye of Horus, over the wound, magically sealing the body whole once more. The body was now whole, sealed, and preserved. It was time for the final Muilam Day ritual, Stepsal, the art of wrapping. This was not just wrapping a body. This was a complex religious rite. It took 2 weeks and used over bone-chum square yards of fine, fresh linen. A team of wrappers, led by a priest who chanted specific spells for each body part, began their work. Every finger, every toe, and the Y was wrapped individually. Then the hands, the feet, the arms and legs. Each limb was wrapped separately before being bound to the body. And as they wrapped, they inserted magic. Hundreds of amulets were placed at precise locations within the linen folds. The Jed pillar for stability, the Tayet knot, the knot of Isis for protection, the Ankh, the symbol of life itself, and finally, the most important amulet of all, the heart scarab. It was placed directly over the mummy's silent, unmoving heart. On its underside was a spell, a desperate plea from the Book of the Dead, a spell addressed to the heart itself. It begged the heart, quote, "O my heart, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not create opposition against me, for you are my Ka, which is in my body." The Egyptian was terrified that on the day of judgment, their own heart would betray them and confess all their hidden sins. This scarab was a magical insurance policy, a gag order on their own conscience. Finally, a thick, black, tar-like resin was poured over the entire wrapped body, sealing it in a hard, protective shell. The wrapping was complete. We have just spent over Mot, Chum words detailing the most complex funeral rite in history. If you are finding this journey into the ancient world as fascinating as we do, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It tells us you want more deep dives like this. The mummy was now complete, but it was not yet a vessel. This is the final step. Step B, the mask and the coffin. A portrait mask was placed over the mummy's head. For a pharaoh, it was solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli. For a noble, it might be cartonnage linen and plaster painted with their face. This was not a true-to-life portrait. It was an idealized face, the face of a god. It was a magical beacon, the first thing the Ba would see when it returned to the tomb, allowing it to instantly recognize its body. The mummy was then placed inside its coffin, or, more often, a series of nested coffins. Each one was covered, inside and out, with protective spells and maps of the underworld. The outermost coffin, the sarcophagus, was a fortress of stone or wood built to defy eternity. And a new human threat, the tomb robber. The Beimui Day process, from death to sealing, was over. But for the soul, the journey had just begun. The sarcophagus was taken to the tomb, the house of eternity. At the tomb's entrance, one final, bizarre ceremony was performed. The opening of the mouth. Priests would touch this adze to the lips of the mummy's mask. Magically, this act reanimated the body. It restored the soul's ability to see, to hear, to speak, and, most importantly, to eat and drink the offerings left in the tomb. The mummy was now sealed in the burial chamber and plunged into total darkness. The Ka stayed with the body, but the Ba began its most dangerous trial. The journey through the Duat. The Duat was the Egyptian underworld, and it was not a pleasant place. It was a terrifying, complex realm of Murihai hours or regions, filled with lakes of fire, giant bladed monsters, and gates guarded by demons who demanded secret passwords. How could a soul possibly navigate this? They had a guide, the Book of the Dead. This was not a book in the modern sense. It was a collection of over high chum magic spells, written on a papyrus scroll and placed inside the coffin. It was the soul's cheat code. When the soul met a demon, the Book of the Dead gave it the password. When it reached a lake of fire, a spell would make the soul immune to the flames. When the great chaos serpent, Apep, tried to devour the soul, a spell would repulse it. This journey was an epic, magical battle. And only after surviving all Muay hours could the soul finally face its ultimate trial. The soul entered the Hall of Two Truths. Before it, the Muay gods, the assessors of the afterlife, and in the center, the scales of justice. The soul was first led by Anubis to perform the negative confession. It had to address each of the Muay gods by name and declare its innocence of a specific sin. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not made anyone weep. I have not been arrogant. I have not spoken evil. Now, the main event. Anubis reached into the soul's spiritual body and pulled out its heart, the Ib. The very heart that was still physically inside the mummy back in the world of the living. He placed the heart on the other side of the scale. This was the moment of truth. The heart, which held the memory of every good and evil deed, was weighed against the pure white feather of Ma'at. The god Thoth, Lord of Wisdom, stood ready to record the verdict, and waiting nearby, it was Ammit, the devourer of the dead. She was the embodiment of the Egyptians' greatest fear. If the heart was heavy, it weighed down by a lifetime of sin, lies, and evil, the scale would tip. Thoth would pronounce the soul guilty. Osiris would give the signal. Ammit, the devourer, would lunge forward and eat the heart. This was not hell. This was worse. This was annihilation, the second death. With its heart devoured, the soul ceased to exist. Its Ka would starve in the tomb. Its Ba would dissolve into nothingness. You were erased from reality. But if the heart was light, if it was free from sin, or if the heart scarab's magic had worked, silencing its confessions, the scales would balance. Thoth would declare the soul Ma-Keru, true voice, vindicated. The great god Horus would then take the justified soul by the hand and present it to the throne of Osiris, the resurrected king of the underworld. Osiris, himself the first mummy, would welcome the soul into paradise, the Arur, the field of reeds. This was the Egyptian heaven, and it was remarkably familiar. It was an eternal, perfect, idealized version of the Egypt they had known and loved. A land without sickness, without pain, without famine. Here, the soul would live for eternity, feasting with the gods, greeting loved ones, and existing in a state of perfect Ak. The pyramids, the valley of the kings, the golden masks, the gruesome hooks, the bone days in salt, the hundreds of yards of linen, all of it, all of this obsession with death, was, in the end, the exact opposite. It was the most complex, expensive, and profound obsession with life the human race has ever produced. These were not monuments to death. They were time machines, fortresses of belief, engineered on the profound, unshakable conviction that life, if preserved correctly, never truly had to end. The Egyptians built their afterlife to last forever. Our journey ends here, but the questions remain. What part of the Egyptian belief system do you find the most fascinating? Was it the gruesome, clinical process of embalming, or the terrifying high-stakes judgment in the Hall of Two Truths? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. We read every one. Thank you for joining us in the ancient world. Until next time, stay curious.